On the morning of the 7th of September, 1695, a warship called the Fancy came out of the haze off the coast of India and ran down a treasure ship 3 times her size. By nightfall, her crew had taken the single richest prize in the history of piracy: gold and silver and jewels belonging to the most powerful man on earth. Then the captain who took it did something almost no pirate ever managed. He vanished. No arrest, no confession, no body, and for 300 years, not one coin anyone could tie back to his hands. This is a story most people think they already know. The pirate who married a princess and ruled his own island kingdom. Almost none of that holds up. So today we're doing something simple. We're taking the famous version of Henry Every and setting it against the actual record piece by piece to see what's left standing when the legend comes off. If you like history told straight, with the myths tested instead of repeated, subscribe. That's the whole channel. Now, back to the man himself, and the ship that wasn't even his to command. 18 months before that morning off the Indian coast, the Fancy sailed under another name and another flag. She was a Spanish privateer called the Charles II, anchored at Corunna in the north of Spain, and Every was her first mate. The crew hadn't been paid in months. Food was short, wages were shorter, and the officers kept promising money that never came. So one night in May of 1694, Every led a mutiny. He put the drunk captain and the loyal men into a boat, pointed them at the shore, renamed the ship, and turned her toward the Indian Ocean. That detail matters more than it looks right now. Hold on to it. The way Every took the Fancy would come back years later to decide how 6 of his men died. By 1695, the richest hunting ground in the world for a pirate was the Red Sea. Every year a fleet left the Mughal port of Surat, sailed up to the Arabian coast, and came back loaded. These were pilgrim ships carrying the faithful home from Mecca, but they doubled as treasure convoys, packed with gold and silver, and the trade goods of the wealthiest empire on the planet. The Mughal Empire at this point controlled about a quarter of the entire world's economy. It was bigger than anything in Europe. One good convoy could set a man up for the rest of his life. Every knew the fleet's route, and he knew where to wait for it. He took the Fancy to the strait at the mouth of the Red Sea, a narrow choke point barely a few miles across, and he sat there. He wasn't the only one with the idea. 5 other pirate ships had gathered at the same spot, drawn by the same prize. One of them was captained by Thomas Tew, already a legend in this world. Rather than fight each other over the convoy, the captains agreed to work together, and they elected Every admiral of the little fleet. His ship was the biggest, 46 guns, and his name carried the most weight. Then they waited. And on the first night, the whole plan nearly fell apart. The Mughal fleet was around 25 ships strong, and under cover of darkness, most of it slipped straight past the waiting pirates and kept sailing. A full year of scheming, gone in the space of one night. But when the sun came up, 2 ships had fallen behind the rest, stragglers, and the pirates could still see them on the water. The first was an armed escort called the Fateh Muhammad. This is where the flotilla paid its first price. Thomas Tew went in against her and was killed in the fighting, cut down by a cannon shot, and his crew broke off. But Every pressed the attack with the Fancy, and this time the escort's crew barely resisted. Maybe they were already battered from the earlier fight. Maybe the sight of 46 guns was enough. Either way, the pirates stripped the Fateh Muhammad of something like 50,000 pounds in treasure. On its own, in that century, that was a staggering fortune. Most men would have taken it and run for the horizon. But there was still one ship out there, the bigger one. Her name was the Ganj-i-Sawai. It means, roughly, exceeding treasure, and she belonged to the Mughal Emperor himself, a man named Aurangzeb. She was enormous. 62 guns of her own, and a guard of 400 to 500 soldiers armed with muskets, on top of hundreds of ordinary pilgrims and passengers. On paper, she outgunned the Fancy, and carried many times her fighting men. If that battle had gone the way the numbers said it should, Every and his crew would have been slaughtered against her hull. It didn't go the way the numbers said, and the reason is almost too lucky to believe. When the 2 ships finally closed and opened fire, one of the huge cannons on the Ganj-i-Sawai exploded on her own deck, and no enemy shot had caused it. The gun simply burst, killing its own gunners and throwing the crew into panic. In the very same moments, a broadside from the Fancy tore the Mughal ship's mainmast down. In the space of a minute or two, she went from a floating fortress to a crippled target crewed by frightened men. The pirates pulled alongside, threw over their grappling lines, and swarmed aboard. And this is where the record turns dark, and where the legend, later on, would try to look the other way. What happened on that ship over the next few days was savage. The pirates tortured the men to force them to give up where the treasure was hidden. They assaulted the women aboard, again and again. And the surviving accounts agree that some of the captives took their own lives rather than face what was coming for them. This was not a clean, clever heist. It was days of violence on a ship full of people coming home from a holy pilgrimage. Keep that picture in your head, because in a few minutes we're going to watch storytellers turn those exact days into a romance. Now, the treasure. This is the part everyone quotes, and it's the first claim we're going to put on trial. You'll hear one number attached to this raid more than any other: 600,000 pounds. In today's money, somewhere around 100 million. It gets repeated as a hard fact, printed in article after article as the largest single haul any pirate ever took in history. But go back to where that number actually comes from, and it starts to wobble fast. Contemporaries never counted the loot into a ledger. They guessed at it, and their guesses ran across a very wide range. The lowest serious figure from the time was about 325,000 pounds. The highest was 600,000. That's a gap almost as big as the smaller number itself. Nobody has ever closed that gap. There was no inventory, no receipt, no clerk standing on the deck writing it all down. 600,000 is simply the top end of a rough estimate that later writers seized on, because it was the most dramatic figure available. Over the years, writers just kept repeating that biggest number, until it stopped sounding like a guess at all. So when you hear that exact figure, treat it the way the records force you to. Yes, it was the richest pirate haul ever recorded, but the precise number was never more than a contemporary estimate, and the honest truth sits somewhere inside a range no one can pin down. Whatever the real total was, it was more than enough to start a war scare. Because the man Every had just robbed was not someone you robbed and simply walked away from. Aurangzeb ruled an empire that dwarfed the kingdoms of Europe. When word reached his court that English pirates had butchered pilgrims and looted one of his own imperial ships, he did not treat it as an ordinary crime. He treated it as an act of war by the entire English nation, and his fury landed squarely on the one English target within his reach: the East India Company. The company was a trading business, nothing more. Its whole fortune depended on being allowed to operate freely inside Aurangzeb's empire. He shut down 4 of its trading posts, threw its officers into prison, and let angry crowds surround them. He threatened to expel the English from India entirely, and even to march on the company's own base at Bombay. In a single stroke, one pirate captain had put the whole English presence in India at risk of total collapse. The company's own men in Surat were very nearly torn apart by mobs who blamed them for something done thousands of miles away by a pirate they had never met. So the company did 2 things at once. It promised Aurangzeb an enormous payment to calm him down, and it turned, with everything it had, toward hunting down Henry Every. What came next had genuinely never been done before. The English crown issued a royal proclamation, naming Every and his men as wanted criminals, and put a bounty of £500 on his head. The East India Company then doubled it, bringing the total reward to £1,000, an almost unimaginable sum for an ordinary sailor's time. Then the wanted notices went out far beyond England, to every port and colony the company could reach, from the Caribbean to the American coast, to the far side of the Indian Ocean. Every governor, every harbor master, every colonial official was told to watch for these men and seize them on sight. Historians generally call this the first worldwide manhunt in recorded history. Not the first hunt for a criminal, but the first coordinated global follow-them-anywhere pursuit of one single crew, reaching across the entire span of an empire. Parliament even branded the pirates enemies of all mankind. That was a formal legal phrase, and it stripped them of any protection, meaning any nation on earth could deal with them however it saw fit. And there's a bitter irony buried in all that effort. The manhunt was meant to stamp out piracy and reassure a furious emperor. Instead, the sheer size of every score did the opposite. Word spread through every waterfront tavern that one ordinary sailor had robbed the richest man on earth and walked away a legend. For hundreds of desperate men sick of hard biscuit and the lash, that was an advertisement. Every became the template, and his example helped light the fuse on the whole golden age of piracy that followed. There was just one problem with the greatest manhunt ever launched. By the time it truly got going, the crew it was chasing had already scattered to the winds. Every had sailed the Fancy across the Atlantic to the Bahamas, to Nassau, which in those days was about as close to a lawless pirate haven as anywhere on Earth. He went to the governor there, a man named Nicholas Trott, and simply bought his welcome. Gifts, a generous cut of the loot, and in the end the fancy herself, handed over as a bribe. For a while it worked perfectly, but when the official proclamation finally caught up and reached Trott, even he had to at least appear to make an arrest. So he quietly warned every first, and the whole crew melted away before anyone could move. Some stayed in the Caribbean, others sailed north for the American colonies, for New England and the Carolinas. A good number simply went home to England and Ireland and tried to vanish back into ordinary life. A few of them didn't vanish carefully enough. And that is where the law finally closed its hand around something solid. The break came from a man named John Dan, one of Every's crew, who made it all the way back to England and stopped at an inn in Kent. He had sewn his share of the gold into the lining of his coat, more than 1,000 pounds of it. A chambermaid tidying his room felt the strange weight of that coat, found the coins hidden inside, and reported him to the town's mayor for the reward. Dan was arrested on the spot. And to save his own neck from the noose, he agreed to turn on his old shipmates and testify against them. With Dan talking, the authorities finally had enough to put 6 of Every's crew on trial in London in the autumn of 1696. The company wanted a conviction desperately. Aurangzeb was still watching from India. The entire point of the trial was to prove to the Mughal court that England hanged its pirates. So the government packed the courtroom with the most senior judges in the country. And then the trial went completely, embarrassingly wrong. The jury acquitted all 6 men. Think about what that actually meant. There were witnesses. There was direct testimony from men who had been aboard the ships. And the jury looked at all of it and let the accused walk free. To an English public that half admired pirates and that saw men like Every as folk heroes stealing from a distant foreign empire, these defendants weren't monsters. They were bold Englishmen who had gone out and struck it rich. So the jury refused to send them to the gallows, which, for the company and the crown, was a full-blown disaster. They had promised Aurangzeb justice, and their own courtroom had just announced to the entire world that England let its pirates go free. That verdict could not be allowed to stand. So they did something that tells you exactly how much politics was riding on the outcome. They refused to accept the acquittal, and they simply arranged a second trial. Here is the cynical little trick at the heart of it. The men couldn't be tried again for the piracy they had just been cleared of, so the prosecutors charged them with a completely different crime instead. The mutiny. Remember how Every first took the fancy, seizing the Charles II from her captain back at Corunna. The prosecution now argued that stealing that ship had itself been an act of piracy. Mutiny was theft. Theft at sea was piracy. And so the mutiny was a hanging offense, entirely on its own, quite separate from anything that happened off the coast of India. This time the jury convicted, and in 1696, 6 of Henry Every's men were taken to the gallows at Execution Dock, on the edge of the Thames, and hanged. But look closely at what they actually died for. They did not hang for the massacre aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai, or for the murdered pilgrims. They hanged for stealing a ship out of a Spanish harbor 2 years before any of that. The law could not get them for the crime the whole world was enraged about, so in the end, it got them for the paperwork. And the man who had led all of it, who fired the broadside and took the treasure and started the war scare in the first place, he was never in that courtroom at all. Every simply walked out of history. The last reliable trace of him has him coming ashore in Ireland in the summer of 1696, and after that, the record goes silent. There's no confirmed sighting of him afterward, no deathbed confession, no grave that anyone can point to today. One of the most wanted men on the entire planet, with a fortune posted on his head and the whole reach of the British Empire looking for him, and he left behind no ending at all. He didn't die in a famous battle, and he didn't hang. He just quietly stopped appearing in the records. And a silence like that is dangerous, because when the hard facts run out, stories rush in to fill the empty space. Which brings us to the second claim we're putting on trial, and it's the most famous one of them all. You've almost certainly heard some version of it. Henry Every didn't just get away. He sailed off to the island of Madagascar, married the Mughal Emperor's own daughter, and set himself up as a pirate king, ruling a golden island paradise with a treasure beyond counting. It's a magnificent story. It is also, as far as the actual evidence goes, completely invented. Watch carefully where it comes from. The first time the princess and the island kingdom appear anywhere in print is 1709, more than a decade after Every had already vanished. It's in a short pamphlet, supposedly written by a Dutchman, who claimed he had once been Evries' captive. That author was almost certainly writing under a fake name, and the pamphlet reads like an adventure novel, because that is essentially what it was. A few years after that, a London stage play reworked Evry into a dashing romantic hero, a king ruling his own island realm. And then, around 1720, Daniel Defoe, the very man who wrote Robinson Crusoe, published an entire book presenting every supposed life as the king of the pirates. None of these were histories. They were entertainment, written for a public that was starving for exactly this kind of tale, and each one built on the last until the fiction started to feel like fact. There is no documentary evidence that Evry married any princess. There is no record of him ruling anything at all in Madagascar. The whole romance was stitched onto him after he disappeared, by writers who had every reason in the world to make him larger than life, and no obligation whatsoever to tell the truth. And remember what the actual record showed happening on that ship. Days of torture, rape, and murder. The legend took those days and quietly rewrote them into a love story, complete with a happy ending on a tropical throne. That is not a small embellishment around the edges. It's the ugliest thing this whole legend does, and it's exactly why testing these claims against the record actually matters. So if the princess and the kingdom are pure fiction, and Evry left behind no body and no confession, is there anything solid left at all? Any physical trace whatsoever of the richest pirate who ever lived? For 3 centuries, the answer was a flat no. And then a man with a metal detector changed that. In 2014, an amateur historian and metal detectorist named Jim Bailey was searching a fruit farm in Middletown, Rhode Island, when he dug up a small, dark, worn silver coin. He assumed at first it was Spanish, or maybe colonial money, but the writing stamped on it was Arabic. When he had it properly studied, the answer that came back was strange. It was a Yemeni coin, a type known as a khamsiya, struck in 1693 on the Arabian coast. It turned out to be one of the oldest coins of its kind ever found anywhere in North America, and its date placed it right on the eve of the raid, exactly the window when that Mughal treasure ship was carrying Arabian silver home. And on its own, that made no sense at all. Colonists scratching out a living in 1690s, New England were not trading with Yemen. There was no honest, ordinary way for a coin like that to end up buried in the soil of a Rhode Island farm. Not unless someone had physically carried it there, from the Arabian coast, across the Atlantic, to the American colonies. Someone who had been near the Red Sea in the mid-1690s, and then crossed the ocean afterward. Someone, in other words, who looked an awful lot like a member of Henry Evry's scattered crew. Then more coins started turning up. More than a dozen of them, all from the same narrow era, found across New England and down the coast. Around 10 in Massachusetts, a few more in Rhode Island and Connecticut, and one as far south as North Carolina, which is precisely where records show some of Evry's men first came ashore. One of the coins was even recovered at a colonial farm site in Connecticut during a proper professional excavation. Its find confirmed by the state archaeologist there, a woman named Sarah Sportman. By now the pattern was very hard to wave away. Arabian silver of exactly the right age was surfacing all along the coast, in precisely the places the Manhunt records say Evry's crew had fled. The most likely explanation ties the whole thing together. To move through the colonies without being caught, Evry seems to have disguised himself as a slave trader, an ugly cover that let him and his men blend straight into ordinary colonial commerce. A ship connected to his crew is documented arriving at Newport, carrying enslaved people in 1696. The scattered coins would be the loose change of that escape, spent or dropped as the crew tried to disappear into ordinary colonial life without drawing a single eye. Now be careful right here, because this is exactly where it gets easy to overclaim. These coins do not prove that Henry Evry himself personally stood on that Rhode Island farm. They can't do that. What they prove is narrower, and honestly more interesting than that. They place treasure of exactly the right origin, and exactly the right date, in exactly the ground where the paper trail says his men landed and vanished. There's even a scholarly caveat floating around the precise dating of that very first coin, which is the kind of honest wrinkle a good story should keep in. Still, it is the closest thing to hard physical evidence that anyone has ever produced for this crew's escape. Not a confession, not a buried chest of gold, just a scatter of small silver coins in entirely the wrong country, quietly telling the end of a story the courtrooms never could. So let's put the whole thing back together now, and see what actually survived the trial. What is proven? That on the 7th of September, 1695, Every and his men took the richest prize in pirate history from a ship of the Mughal Emperor, and did it with real, documented brutality. That the raid nearly destroyed the entire English trading position in India. That it triggered the first worldwide manhunt ever recorded. That 6 of his men hanged for it, though technically for stealing a ship rather than for the killings. And that the man himself was never once caught. What is not proven? The exact size of the haul, which lives forever inside a range no one has ever managed to close. And the entire glittering romance of the pirate king and his stolen princess, which is fiction from the first word to the last, invented by writers years after every was already gone. So here's the real question, and I genuinely want you to answer this one in the comments. Now that we can trace his stolen silver right into American soil, which version do you actually believe? That Henry Every quietly lived out his days as a free and comfortable man in the colonies under a false name, or that he was cheated, robbed, and left to die broke and forgotten, the way the legend never lets him? Make your case below. I read them. And if the idea of pirates hiding in plain sight in colonial America pulls at you, that is exactly where we're heading next. Because Every was not the only one who came ashore and disappeared into a quiet town. And one of those towns has a far darker story than the pirates it sheltered. That one is coming soon. Subscribe so you're here when it lands.